Hello, my name is Frank Pasquale, and I am a professor at Brooklyn Law School. And today I'll be giving a presentation on technology, large technology firms, and their relation to LPE, looking particularly at the really interesting moves that have been happening on both the anti-monopoly and regulated industry sides. I've decided to title this lecture and introduce as a theme here the idea of beyond scientism. And what I mean by scientism is I want to refer us at the very outset of this lecture to the classic administrative law trichotomy between politics, science, and law, or democracy, legal regularity, and expertise. And I think one of the issues that is really at the core of our mission here is to try to understand what were the key economic ideas that were either properly denoted as or masquerading as science that were used in order to rationalize the gradual rollback of antitrust law in the US with respect to large technology firms, and were key to movements toward deregulation since at least the 1960s up through the 2010s. And I call this scientism rather than science because I think in many ways these economistic approaches did not actually fully embrace and understand the overarching trends and social science findings about these platforms, much less reflect popular discontent or other movements questioning their power. And I think that we are now finally at a stage where we're beginning to move beyond the scientism toward, I think, more robust forms of expertise, more pluralistic forms of expertise and plural methodologies, and also toward integrating in more perspectives, and in that way, vindicating the democratic and political foundations of the legitimacy of the administrative state, both with respect to its applications to competition law and its applications in regulated industries. So just to move forward with respect to setting the stage here. What are our contemporary trusts? We've been talking a lot about antitrust over the course of our AMRI Summer Academy. So how would we describe contemporary trusts? Well, certainly Tim Wu, who's now a White House advisor, a former Columbia law professor, has a wonderful book called The Curse of Bigness, which I reviewed last year, which talked about how there are some really interesting parallels between the extraordinary concentration of industry in, say, the Gilded Age and many of our leading technology firms. And just as you can imagine the old cartoons of the Sugar Trust and the Copper Trust and others sort of sitting in the back of the Senate gallery and bossing around the senators, I think that we could imagine that over many years, there was a social trust, a search trust, an online retail trust, an operating system duopoly, and an app store duopoly that had enormous power over the structure of online life. And what's so fascinating here is that, as someone who has been following this for a couple of decades, in the 2000s, the narrative about many of these firms was that they were the scrappy edge providers who were going to empower consumers to rise up and take on the dominant cable companies, internet service providers, content providers, et cetera. And in some ways that's happened. But on the other hand, the other transformation has been that some of these upstarts have now become, or one-time upstarts and long time ago upstarts, have now become some of the most powerful firms in not just in US society, but in the world. Now, if we were to consider where does antitrust law and policy sit with respect to these large technology firms, I'd like to identify at least three different, let's say, genera or genuses of antitrust, right? And these come out of an engagement with both the mainstream establishment antitrust academy and the policy think tanks, and also with the more insurgent and I think newer approaches that are now on the horizon. So I want to start with capital favoring antitrust. And I think that there's a lot of ways in which the antitrust establishment, especially that which is underwritten and advanced by quote unquote big law or the largest law firms really was developing a doctrine that favored large aggregations of capital vis-a-vis labor. I also think, though, there was something I'd call the Trumpist corollary, which is that over the Trump administration, there were some examples where an overall capital favoring antitrust regime sometimes would favor one sector of capital over others, in part to advance the agenda of Trump himself. So I have a piece that'll be coming out soon with Jackie Green called Two Politizations of Antitrust, where we talk about what we see as the misuse of antitrust law with respect to merger review applied to cannabis firms. There's a good piece in Just Security about that. And then also misuses with respect to allegations of conspiracy to require conspiracies related to green standards, both with respect to banking and with automobiles. And we really worry that essentially there's the problem here is that some of the things that Trump did that really seem to most people in the field to be misuses of antitrust law, they paint a broad brush in calling that politicization, because there are some good politicizations of antitrust law that we're going to get into a bit, but that the effort to just go after, say, cannabis firms because people high up in DOJ didn't like marijuana was a really troubling example of misuse of antitrust law. Now, in opposition to this, we often see establishment antitrust law. And in establishment antitrust approaches, their main approach to establishing their legitimacy is to say that, at one point in the history of antitrust, there were all of these cases out there. They'd go all sorts of different ways. It was very hard to figure out how the courts would rule. And over time, what we've done is we've brought in econometricians. We've brought in these very sophisticated measurements of consumer welfare. And we provide legitimacy to this body of law via determinacy, via quantification. Now, of course, there are already counter narratives developing over the past 10 years. There was a great piece by Jesse Eisinger called The Professors Who Make $1,000 an Hour that talked about the serious pecuniary motives that may have animated some of the experts in these fields, or at least the sort of firms that were developing as the main sources of this competition law expertise. But overall, though, I think that these were forms of naturalist social science, modeling social science on, say, physics, and saying, just as we might, say, be able to measure the volume of water in a lake after a rainfall, we can measure the amount of consumer welfare in the society after a merger, right? And this is very tempting. There's a lot of physics envy among lawyers and others, and sort of science envy. And that, I think, was the main way in which establishment antitrust tried to establish itself as a mode of science, as an integration of economics into law that made law better. Now, more recently, we've seen the emergence of what I believe David Dayen christened neo-Brandeisian antitrust, of course, hearkening back to Louis Brandeis and some of his classic work on behalf of consumers and against sort of large aggregations of corporate power. And we certainly see this tradition, I think, vindicated in Zephyr Teachout's book, Break 'em Up. Zephyr also, by the way, has a wonderful recent article on antitrust and human development, which I think is well worth reading. However, there is a tension, I would say, within neo-Brandeisian antitrust between a group I'd broadly call the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. The Jeffersonians being much more into, say, a decentralized approach, and the Hamiltonians being a bit more centralist and perhaps being more open to some of the regulated industries approaches that I'm going to get into later on in today's lecture. Now, before getting into, though, these ideas of neo-Brandeisian antitrust and elaborating a bit more on the other forms of American antitrust pluralism, I wanted to note something about a interesting parallel between monopoly and monarchy, right? And we often see in defenses of monopolistic firms the sense that a single provider can demonstrate efficiency in generating goods and services. And therefore, that's legitimate. It's the most efficient way of providing these goods and services. And I think that we, on the one hand, that can be seen as just a classic example of social science trying to assess the overall positive effect, say, of an institution or set of laws in society. But I also think we should not miss the fact that, the same arguments can be made for monarchy, right? That there's efficiency in generating social order, and therefore let's have a monarchy. And the reason I bring this up, and I realize I have a mess of books here, but essentially the first three books, I just wanted to tie together a bit of the book on Pinochet, the antitrust paradox, and the road to serfdom, because I think what's so interesting recently is that we have seen a lot of interest in retelling the history of neoliberalism as a history not of a renovation and restoration of liberal ideals and an application of general ideas of liberty to the economy, but instead of something of a Faustian bargain between those who would advance libertarianism in the economy and sort of preserving forms of power in the economy that are unquestioned and in some ways absolutist, and social factions that favor, say, authoritarian rule. And that was certainly part of, say, Corey Robin's attention to the interest of Hayek and the so-called Chicago boys in Pinochet's regime. And I think it's something worth noting. I've also recently saw a great article called Neo-Illiberalism that talks about this sort of illiberal turn, because I think there is an incredibly important aspect to democratizing the economy that anti-monopoly law is meant to do, and that pro-labor regulation is meant to do. And so therefore, I think we should not be surprised by elective affinities between anti-democratic and pro-monopoly arguments. And I think that the collection, The Road from Mount Pelerin, and Murawski's solo-authored book, Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste, do a terrific job in exposing those elective affinities. And I think that's something that we want to combat. Now, let me talk a bit about the Hamiltonian vision, right, of a strong state and essentially the ideals behind it. Kay Sabil Rahman, one of my colleagues at Brooklyn Law School, I think has written a modern classic article on something along the lines of what can structure a Hamiltonian vision in his article, The New Utilities, right? And in The New Utilities, what Rahman is looking at is the power of certain very powerful technology firms and how it might be curtailed. Three ways in which it might be curtailed. First is by firewalling core necessities away from behaviors and practices that might contaminate the basic provision of these goods and services, including through structural limits on corporate organization and form of firms that provide infrastructural goods. Okay, so and I'll get into in a bit a more concrete vision of how this would be accomplished, say, in search or social networks or in massive online retail spaces like Amazon. Second would be imposing public obligations on infrastructural firms, whether negative obligations to prevent discrimination or unfair disparities in prices, or positive obligations to proactively provide equal, affordable, and accessible services. So this is something that we saw often in looking at Google insistence on, say, common carriage regulation, which is something that I try to draw some analogies to in the 2008 article I've put in the recommended readings. That just as we expect the phone company to serve every home, that we would expect that each website on the internet would be indexed by Google, barring some rationale, some publicly accessible and understandable rationale otherwise, or at least, and moreover, that there would be equal treatment of them within certain groups. And so this, I think, gets to the core, say, of the antitrust case or the competition law case of Foundum in Europe. This was a vertical search engine that, according to some of the filings that I have read, said that it was suddenly downranked by Google and was told that its price for advertising was going to go up 100-fold relatively soon after Google had introduced its own vertical price comparison search engine that would be a direct competitor. And the idea here would be that there would be a public obligation, to carry, not only to carry such a firm, but to treat it fairly. And certainly among the 5 House antitrust bills that I think were just marked up in committee very recently, in June of 2021, we see something similar animating those bills. And then the third is to create public options, state-chartered, cheaper, basic versions of services that would offer an alternative to exploitative public-private control. The classic debate on public options is, of course, or the classic presentation of public option is Ganesh Sitaraman's and Alstott's book, Public Options, published by Harvard University Press. But we also see, I recall from probably the most famous example of this was in the healthcare sector, in the healthcare arena, the idea that having a public option for insurance could discipline the private insurance market because the private insurance market got too exploitative, charged too much, covered too little. People could turn to the public option, say a Medicare for all or Medicare for all who want it type of option. And similarly, we've seen some really interesting proposals for public options in, say, search engines. Okay, so there was a proposal in Europe called Quairo that was going to be a French-German search engine. I think that they had budgeted about 450 million euros for it, but then ultimately they figured that they could not keep up with the amount of money and that Google was putting into its search engine, and they gave up on it. There were proposals for a Portuguese language search engine. And I think this is just so fascinating because I think that there really is a need for a public alternative here, or at least a substrate of, say, the whole indexed web, and then allow other firms to organize it as they would, or other entities to organize it as they would. But it really is not nearly as well developed in the tech space as it has been developed in the healthcare space or some of the other spaces that Ganesh and Anne have looked at in their public options book. Now, moving forward, I think that Lena Khan, our lecturer from last week, or from a couple of weeks ago, did a wonderful job in separation of platforms and commerce in explaining some parallels between these technology firms that I've been discussing and the finance sector, and how decades of finance regulation could lead us to have some inspiration for tech regulation. What's the common idea? Well, if I had to put it in the most sort of accessible terms, I would say, as I said in the book Black Box Society, that whereas finance occupies the commanding heights of the economy by often determining what entities are funded, right? And funding is just so critical to getting a business off the ground, that a lot of these firms in search or organizing large online retail space are the key to being found, right? To visibility, to salience. And so if we think about this connection between being funded and being found, then clearly I think some of the rules that, say, separated the funding firms from competing against the firms which they were funding, right? Because if they could just pull the funding, then they could suddenly allow their preferred alternative to suddenly win. The same type of concerns arise when lawmakers want to stop self-preferencing or illicit self-preferencing by the large tech platforms that would allow them to crush any particular entity that is using their platform to reach their clientele. I'd also note that just my own work on data-informed duties talks a lot about the need for industrial policy and AI development. And finally, in the reading, Hal Singer's proposal for an internet tribunal really gets into the weeds about what it would look like to have this kind of very micro-level regulation of fair treatment by platforms of particular entities. Now, I also want to note the Jeffersonian vision, right? And the Jeffersonian vision, I think presently, I would associate more with a populist vision. Monopolies are not merely bad at providing consumer welfare, they suck, as Sally Hubbard says, right? And we have Matt Stoller's book, Goliath, and Stoller is certainly, I think would proudly call himself a populist. And I remember writing about, the Tea Party as a potential, or I'm sorry, a potential convergence of, say, the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street. This was something I was analyzing politically, about a decade ago. I think you see a similar energy here when you have, say, 72 senators voting for Lena Khan, right? That you have essentially a populist energy that says, wow, we are really sick of these big companies exercising so much power over our lives. And certainly the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, which has looked into a lot of Amazon's power and tried to vindicate the rights and interests of small businesses, the Open Markets Institute, American Economic Liberties Project, all I think have a vision that's a broadly Jeffersonian one of allowing smaller firms to flourish, right? So rather than having, to give a classic example of a Amazon Basics purchase, rather than having Amazon produce all the backpacks in America, right? If you search for backpack or on Amazon, you'll probably find their Amazon Basics has thousands of positive reviews, is in fact a great bag, is made so cheaply because they can order, they have such scale, they can go to suppliers and order 1 million of them or whatever it might be. And whereas the small artisan producer may only be able to order 500 or 1,000 or something. And the Jeffersonians say, look, even if it would be cheaper to have one firm create one bag for everyone, we want to create a world in which there can be tens or hundreds or thousands of firms, right? And one quick question is there something in between those two? And some people say that, we should, maybe 10 firms is optimal. But at the very least, the Jeffersonians remind us that we don't want to just have one firm or very few, that we ought to strive for an economy that is more diverse, that is not so monocultural. Now, in Black Box Society, one of the things that I argue is that there are so many options that are relevant here, right? One just very technocratic approach is data interoperability that would allow, for example, making very hard and fast rules that would make it much easier for me to say, take all of the information that's been gathered about me by one platform and take it to another, right? That sort of interoperability and portability. Another would be, say, forcing some of these firms to license their data stores or what they have that's valuable. So an example there might be that you have on Google Book Search, it's a really tremendous resource, and they invested a huge amount in order to, and they invested in litigation, right, to have the ability to copy books at 5 major university libraries and from many other sources in between. And at one level, they might say, well, if anyone else wants to do it, they can go to those universities, they can copy all those books again, et cetera. But, if we were to really have that as a solution, I mean, you've got what a waste, right? And also you risk breaking the books and putting them through the ringer of being copied all over again into one massive database. Why not require licensing at a fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory rate, right? That FRAND approach, fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory, that's a cornerstone of some forms of patent remedies. And in this case, maybe it would make sense so that we could have many different entities that are organizing the world's books. Because even though Google's motto at one point was to organize the world's knowledge, just to say that motto, I think, is to reveal the profound arrogance at the heart of, say, having one firm organize the world's knowledge. Any one of us who's done any sort of serious research project knows that there are so many different ways to organize knowledge. And I've recently been reading Gaddis's book, The Landscape of History. And similarly, just the incredible plurality of ways to tell the story reflects also in forms of organizations. We may want to see something like that. Divestiture is really important. I'm going to talk a little bit about some easy cases for divestiture that I think are on the horizon. Behavioral remedies would require any of these firms that once they say merge or take over other firms, that they do not unfairly use that advantage from merging or taking over or acquiring other firms to create modes of unfair competition, regulation as well, and fines. And I think that moreover, that when there are these fines, some portion should be earmarked for future monitoring and enforcement. I think that really ensuring that there are robust, independent authorities that are self-funded, that actually have forms of self-funding the same way that the Food and Drug Administration via the Prescription Drug User Fee Act gets money from firms that it regulates in order to help assure its quality of review and to be able to invest in an ongoing way in its reviews, that the same thing should be going on in these areas, because we know that these are major, massive firms and that we're going to need to have this type of input. And we should try to protect that type of regulation from the vagaries of politics and being just suddenly cut if they happen to do something that might be slightly unpopular with powerful senators. Now, one of the things that I wanted to get into in terms of thinking about this, and actually I'll come back to this earlier slide for a second, is how have recent antitrust cases affirmed neo-Brandeisian approaches, right? And I don't have time in this lecture, or really we don't have time in the Academy this summer, to get into the fine-grained details of the Sherman Act, the Clayton Act, et cetera. That really is more of a topic for a full-on antitrust course. However, I do think that what I can highlight for you is some of these recent, 2020 complaints against big tech firms launched to the Federal Trade Commission, here by the 2 Democratic commissioners and by the Republican chairman, or at the DOJ, or by the states, et cetera. And some of the activities that they focused in on as being indicative of monopolization and illicit activity. And here, this is just a quote from the FTC complaint against Facebook, which I want to recommend as reading. I forgot to include it in the reading, but I would just say that that would be something that, if of all the complaints I mentioned today, I would most recommend the FTC complaint, because I think it is really well written and really easy to understand, and a compelling narrative. To quote it, they tell a story about Facebook, right? They tell a story about Facebook essentially, or they tell a story about social media in the 2000s as being a contestable space. And I certainly remember this ferment. I remember having a Friendster account, or having a MySpace account, then having to get a Friendster account, then doing another account, et cetera, and then going to Facebook. And the idea here is that it wasn't just that Facebook solved social networking, right? You still see to this day apologists for Silicon Valley saying, well, why are Facebook and Google, et cetera, so powerful? Well, Google solved search and Facebook solved social media. I mean, it's remarkable to me to see this type of characterization, the idea that this could be solved like a math equation, right? Fundamental relations of production and social relations could just be solved like a math equation by some geniuses in Silicon Valley. No, that's not really the way we should frame this. Instead, the story that the FTC is telling, the narrative they're telling, is that after identifying 2 significant competitive threats, Facebook moved to squelch them, reflecting the ethos of the CEO's Mark Zuckerberg, quote, "It is better to buy than compete," right? And I think that quote from Mark Zuckerberg will probably be second in line, his second most famous quote. The other most famous quote was, of course, what he said about people who trusted them, which I won't repeat. This is a family presentation, but I think it was quite indicative about the company's attitudes toward privacy as they've been demonstrated over time. Moreover, one of the accusations here is that to entrench its position, Facebook has also imposed anti-competitive conditions that restricted access to its valuable platform. Conditions that Facebook personnel themselves recognize as anti-user and hypocritical, okay? Showing they're scared they can't compete on their own merits. So this, I think, is really critical because, years ago, we used to hear from the establishment about Facebook acquisitions, and that you can go to pages in Wikipedia on acquisitions by Google, acquisitions by Facebook. It's remarkable the number of companies that they have acquired. We used to hear, oh, well, it's all leading to something that's more efficient overall. But what we're seeing here is a very different story, that ultimately it's about knocking out competition, not about competing more effectively. The Department of Justice in several states then are suing Google, and they have alleged that Google unlawfully maintains monopolies in the markets for general search services, search advertising, and general search text advertising via anti-competitive and exclusionary practices. The idea behind it is that Google is able to lock up the market for search advertising, thereby extracting higher prices for ads, and indirectly raises the prices of goods and services whose sales fund these advertisements. Right. And you might say, looking at this like, oh, who cares? It's just the advertising market. Like it's maybe, they're going to take money as opposed to the marketing firms, et cetera. But when you really look at the extraction machine that's been built by Google, it's remarkable to think about how much entities have to pay. And I recently just was listening to a podcast about entities that are developing software that allow firms to sort resumes. And according to the CEO of one of these firms, this was on a podcast called Machines We Trust by the MIT Tech Review, one of the CEOs said that firms are now willing to pay 25% of a recruit's first year salary to be given by an AI firm a list of 2 or 3 candidates that are just easily ready to hire, that they could just pick any of the 2 or 3 and easily hire them. And that's kind of remarkable because I thought to myself, if I were one of those 2 or 3 candidates, I'd want that 25% of my first year salary. I wouldn't want it going to the AI firm, the intermediary that is supposedly bringing, great rationalization to HR recruiting. But rather it's being siphoned off in that way. We're going to see many examples of that in today's lecture, especially, by the way, in this case, billions of dollars to Google or to Apple to be the default search engine. And by the way, this money to Apple reflects models of competition that were theorized by Ariel Ezrahi and Maurice Stuckey in their book, Virtual Competition, which I think just has a number of very interesting counter narratives to the classic economic narratives about competition. And one last meta point I should make is I'm talking a lot about narrative today, and you may think, we're talking about economics. Isn't that a social science? Isn't that something that's more like physics or math? And why is this professor talking about narratives? Well, I think that the more that I explore philosophy of social science and the theories of social science, the more attracted I am to accounts of narrative economics and the role of narrative economics. Bob Schiller, the Nobel Prize winner, has written a whole book on this. I think there's actually much better work being done by Jens Beckert and has been done by Deirdre McCloskey on the role of narrative in economics and economic sociology as well. And part of this is just sort of recognizing that the way in which the social science and the economic models filter into and have legal effect is ultimately a narrative effort. And that's the stories that are being told in these complaints are very important, under-recognized, and I think ultimately more truthful and more apt stories about technological development than the ones that have been advanced by the establishment over the past couple of decades. Next is the Texas versus Facebook and Google case. This was the one advised by Dean Srinivasan, and that's why I included Srinivasan's article in our reading for today. Here the idea is that the complaint here alleges something akin to bid rigging in the relationship between Facebook and Google. Sorry, let me go back. The allegation here is that Facebook curtailed its involvement with header bidding in return for Google giving Facebook information speed and other advantages in the auctions that Google runs for publishers' mobile app advertising inventory each month. And here, just again, sometimes the technical details of this can be a little off-putting or daunting, but let me imagine this analogy. Imagine that you had two major realty companies in a city, and one of them says, we will take everything to the west of First Avenue, and you take everything to the east, right? So if we get anybody coming to us who is to the west, we're going to refer them to you, and then you take everything to the east, and we're just going to divide it up that way, right? And in this way, that makes each of them, you once had a duopoly where there was some hope of competition, right, where people could negotiate. But then once you divide it up that way, then each one has a monopoly. One is the monopoly of the one east, one is the monopoly of the west. And this, I think, is the concern here, right? That if you have these sorts of deals, this sort of something that I think was theorized by Neil Buff and Ayers as a co-opetition, but here quite a troubling form of co-opetition or just cooperation and collusion, that can really worry us. Now, of course, for all of the things that I've mentioned, these are complaints. These are allegations. I've not said that these have been proved up in a court of law, but I think it's quite something. And I don't think that these entities would be making these complaints if they did not have a lot to back them up. Okay. Now, I've given you some examples of some really troubling problems here, right? And why did it take so long? Part of this is we need to understand the history. Scholars have been sounding the alarm for some time. In Federal Search Commission, Oren Bracha and I raised a lot of concerns about the power of search engines. In 2012, 2013, the FTC was investigating Google, along the lines of that DOJ lawsuit, but they ultimately decided not to do anything. What's remarkable is that, afterwards, there were documents that were secret at the time that were revealed at first in this kind of humorous way that they failed to redact them in this some document production. But basically, they showed that a lot of the staff, the lawyers, wanted to sue, but the economists did not want to sue. And that sort of allowed the forms of quantitative expertise, or as I often think, faux expertise, to quash and to silence what I thought was quite a powerful case that had developed by the lawyers. And I had some sense of that. I didn't have the secret documents, but I had a sense of that. And that's why I wrote this, How the FTC Failed to Explain Its Inaction article. And then finally, I think that there are just many critical scholarly interventions that just were not taken seriously. And the reason I think goes to the second bullet point, which is the political economy of big tech expansion. One is that a lot of these firms became very powerful because they simultaneously won big in several key areas: in trademark, in copyright, in privacy, in contract with terms of service, and antitrust. And we can go through in the Q&A or discussion how they won in each of those areas. But what started happening is that the sort of the legal playing field just started being so tilted toward the platforms that it became such a clear example of the way in which law can lead to political advantage, can lead to economic advantage, which can then be reinvested into legal advantage via things like spending enormous amounts on lobbying, enormous amounts on advertising, on nonprofits that would advance the ideas and cause of the large tech firms. And also, I saw a lot of charismatic identification with one of the US's leading industries. I had some, just discussions with people high up at the FTC who would just say, well, look, this is our leading industry, and this I think is really important to think about, is tech as a national champion. And we see some of those arguments to this day. What I think is fascinating over the last couple of years is that we've seen simultaneous crackdowns on tech in Europe, China, and the US. And so perhaps the idea here is that governments have to, in a way, act together if they're going to be able to get a handle on the large tech firms within their jurisdictions. Now, very quickly, I wanted to just go through some of the myths of big tech antitrust laissez-faire. And I think that this is sort of an elaboration on ideas from my When Antitrust Becomes Pro-Trust article, but I'll go through each of them in the following slides: the myth of easy platform switching, the myth of the heroic consumer, and the myth of platforms perfecting markets. With respect to the myth of easy platform switching, the idea there was that consumers, if they feel hard done by, say, a particular platform, that they can just move to a different platform, right? But is it really going to be the same experience? I mean, just try to download and import all the data Google has built up about you and how it uses that to provide better search services, better email services, better whatever services elsewhere. I will bet that a few, if anyone, when we have our discussion, will give us a good example of having done that. However, I'd be interested if anyone has. Please let us know. Please give us the secret. Okay. Also, try to get all your friends to leave Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitter en masse. Not likely to happen. I remember once giving a presentation to one of the competition-inclined think tanks that was more establishment about Uber, and they said to me, well, look, if you think that Uber is treating you badly, why don't you just compare prices on Lyft? And I said to them, I go, at the time, I was traveling between Baltimore and New York every couple of weeks. And I said to them, when I am going to New York and I need an Uber or a ride share to the train station, I'm usually in a rush. I've got to get together all my stuff. I've got 3 things on my mind. Is that really the time when I'm going to just settle down in my easy chair, bring out my 5 different rideshare apps, make up a spreadsheet and compare the price of them? No, right? But one of the things that what's so interesting about this is, I said this and there were sort of these uneasy glances. And, I think that the younger people there, or the people that sort of had just begun, really it resonated. But I think for many of the people that had been part of the establishment for a while, their modes of recognizing reality had been so constrained by what they anticipated to be the evidentiary standards, to screen out, say, arguments from lived experience, that they couldn't take this seriously, right? They just saw me as a grumbler. And I think this is very troubling. And I think that part of what the future of collaboration and integration and harmonization of politics, science, and law, or expertise, democracy, and due process and legal regularity is going to involve is thinking about what forms of social science and inquiry and other forms of knowledge actually allow us to recognize common sense, right? Which is so often cut out of these discussions, okay? There's also a myth of the heroic consumer, right? This idea of, well, if you wanted privacy, you can read the privacy policies or you could negotiate for that. But could that really happen? No. If I were to try to negotiate with Facebook over its privacy policy, if I were to say, hey, I've copied out your terms of service and I've got a counteroffer, and I were to send that off to Palo Alto or wherever it's headquartered, who would I even write to? Who could I talk to? It's just a total myth. And so, and moreover, let's say that it's not about that, but let's say it's about some other issue, to go back to some of the, say, more contestable platforms. This is not an enjoyable process. This is labor, right? And so when people sort of say, well, consumers can decide and consumers can figure out this complicated world of platforms and technology, a lot of times they try to characterize that as being as joyful or interesting as shopping for clothes or shopping for food or what have you. But to many people, it's just utterly frustrating, incomprehensible. It's like shopping for insurance, particularly when insurance wasn't standardized as it finally was for the individual market in the Affordable Care Act. And so, I think that that's really an important thing to just push back on. And then finally, there's this idea of the myth of platforms perfecting markets, right? The idea that platforms would essentially perfect whatever market that they're part of. And part of this, comes from, say, people like Hal Varian being the key economist at Google, others. But, the deeper we get into these markets, the more we question them. That certainly is a lesson of Dina Srinivasan's work. There are harsh realities of shoddy and defective goods and platforms enjoying substantial legal immunities. That's in the Janger and Twersky's article about Amazon. And they didn't even, or I don't believe they even get heavily into CDA 230. They're just looking at some elements of liability law, given their expertise in torts. And moreover, I'd say, if we were to think about labor markets and perfecting labor markets, is the perfected labor market one where platforms and their algorithms have driven wages as low as possible? Certainly, I think that when I look at the FTC's letter to Seattle, after it warned Seattle that it was potentially risking antitrust liability for helping drivers as quote unquote independent contractors organize vis-a-vis Uber, I just thought that was utterly bizarre. And I once wrote in one piece, if those at the FTC really believe that we need to avoid having independent contractor workers organized to try to have some sort of standards vis-a-vis the platform companies on which they're selling their labor, maybe the FTC should take this to heart. Maybe their own attorneys should essentially have their jobs put up on TaskRabbit every month, right? If you really believe in this stuff, and I certainly would put this to any tenured professor of economics who pushes Uber and Lyft, or Uber and Lyft and Deliveroo and TaskRabbit and all these others as optimal markets for labor, put your own job up. I might bid for, say, to teach certain law and economics courses at certain schools. I might be able to bid to do it for cheaper, right? And so I think that this is, but of course, if we really think about it, I was reading a book by Tabb called Reconstructing Political Economy. We don't do that. And we don't try to make that the model of most jobs. Why? Because we couldn't survive the instability, right? No one wants to go to bed at night knowing that they could wake up the next morning unemployed because someone bid $5 cheaper to do their job that day. It's just inhumane. And so therefore we have to bring this sense of humanity, I think, to these markets, as opposed to just thinking that platforms are going to perfect them. Now, very quickly, my last few points here, I may have to leave a few of these for the final lecture or for our discussion. More competition is one answer. Certainly, Elizabeth Warren has been visionary and brave in pushing this forward. I think it's relatively easy to break up Facebook Blue. That's what they call the classic Facebook within Facebook, to distinguish it from its myriad acquisitions. Facebook Blue, WhatsApp, and Instagram. Tim Wu has written on that behalf as well. I think breaking up YouTube and Google would be a great idea. Separation of platform and commerce in Khan, and then I think in a more popular mode in Elizabeth Warren's Big Tech Plan, which she published on Medium. All of those are easy cases, I think. The economic case here is clear, that I think that you can have a more competitive search ecology and other things that would lead to more funds and more consumer welfare overall, and also a more democratized, more just economy. But there are harder cases, right? And here I wanted to give an example as someone that gives lots of talks online. Like I think I've given at least 50 online at various different universities and for different groups, et cetera, so far this year. And a lot of times I will get, especially if I do talks for Europe, like the Blue Jeans platform or some other platform that is just, I have to relearn, right? It's like I know Zoom, but now I have to learn this other platform and I don't quite know how to share the screen or how to mute myself or how to do whatever. And I've got to maybe have a pre-call and talk with people for a half hour, et cetera. And it adds up, right? If we were to have 15 different online video conferencing platforms, it adds up in terms of everybody having to learn different things. And if we didn't dig up the road 15 times, put in 15 different lines to each person's house, we said, hey, it's a utility, let's regulate the utility. And I think there's a recognition in law of this, particularly, and this is in copyright law of all things, but, if you look at copyright law and the treatment of macros in Lotus v. Borland or of application programming interfaces in Google v. Oracle, there's a similar idea that like these are essentially things that we don't want everyone to have a totally different way of doing basic things. And so therefore, to me, it would probably make more sense to try to just regulate Zoom well, rather than having a million different online video conferencing platforms. But I could be wrong. You can convince me otherwise, right? And I'm inspired here by Stuckey and Mizrahi as well, who point out ways in which competition can be troubling or bad or a zero-sum arms race. I also think that, some people say that we could have multiple search engines because something called common crawl could just continually be crawling the web and could give other entities ways of plugging in, but maybe not. Maybe that won't ever work, maybe there'll just never be enough resources for that. And here, I have there are people who sharply disagree with me on this, and I'm sure we'll have a few at the conversation that we have would say, no, we've really got to invest in this and make multiple search engines. I don't know, multiple comprehensive search engines. I don't know, but I do think that like we should at least be open to the possibility that there will just be one big one, or at least that the Google will just so dominate that it needs to be treated like utility. And there's other examples. A few other ways of thinking about this. Note that we regulated firms, with respect to cable, and that's one reason why I added in that Beyond Innovation and Competition article that I wrote in 2010 to the suggested reading. And I think that we can also regulate potential natural monopolies in techs. So for example, if we don't want to each learn, say, 20 different app stores or look in 20 different app stores for whatever app we might want, and if you want a preview of that, try to find a particular show on a streaming service now. Is it really better now that we might have to spend $20 for Hulu and $10 for Crave and $5 for World of Wonder and $15 for whatever, rather than say having it all bundled and then a regulated bundle? Similarly, we might say, let's have an app store, but just have it regulated, right? And so we might regulate it and then limit the cut that Google and Apple take. Right now, if you look at, for example, the Epic v. Apple lawsuit, I think it is at this point, there's complaints by these those who are selling apps on the stores saying, look, they're taking a huge amount of what we're making and they're not providing that sort of value to us or to customers. So we could regulate that. How could we do it? Well, one idea would be to follow what we did with insurers in the Affordable Care Act. We could look at the role of the insurer between the patient and the doctor and say, when you pay premiums to the insurer, at least 80% has to go to medical services and quality improvements. If the insurer isn't paying that, you get a refund. Okay. Similarly, online, we could say something like, rather than taking 30%, you only get 20%, right? And you have to demonstrate that that's actually going, and you only get that 20% of administrative costs. You either can give all the 80% to the makers of the apps, or hey, maybe you pay the people that are using Google, pay the people that are using Facebook. Who knows, maybe this is the first step toward a universal basic income, right? So, and I think this is really an interesting type of proposal. It's something that I started advancing back in 2009 about cable companies. I tried to draw the comparison between insurers and cable companies in 2009. I think the same type of argument could be made now with respect to a lot of these big tech firms. So the conclusion. My conclusion is that there can be, and this might be a really good point for discussion, some tensions between antitrust and regulated industries, right? If you think that something is a natural monopoly, you aren't necessarily all that keen on making many different competing versions of it. But the present is so problematic that steps in either direction could be justified. I've made that case in the Tech Platforms article that you can find for free online, or in my most recent book, New Laws of Robotics, Chapter 7, which has similar types of reflections. The key is recognizing how law can slowly rebalance a playing field that is now centripetally accumulating data, wealth, and power in the largest tech firms. And I want to leave you with the stakes, and the stakes, I believe, are very stark. They are either that we begin to get serious about regulating big technology firms, or we give up the power, we'll be regulated by them. I have a piece on from territorial to functional sovereignty that describes that denouement on the LPE blog. It's based on my speech that I gave for the German Social Democrats Foundation a few years ago. And I think it's really important that we move forward on it. So thank you so much for listening to this lecture. I really look forward to our discussion.